I was grateful and fortunate that I was given that uniqueness from him, the arrogance. In many ways, it looks, oh my God, how cocky is he? No, trust me, there's a price to pay for success. You can't buy it.
Gordon Ramsay is one of the most recognizable names in global food culture. A multi-Michelin-star chef turned television star who has built an empire on exacting standards, unsparing criticism, and theatrical intensity. That same intensity has produced more than a few public clashes. Legendary mentor relationships collapsed into bitter fallouts. Critics exchanged barbs. Protégés split to start rival empires, and fellow chefs publicly questioned Ramsay's style. The following deep dive explores 6 of the most visible and consequential disputes that have shaped Ramsay's public story, not to cheapen them into gossip, but to understand how personality, ambition, and industry pressure fuse into headline-making conflict. Marco Pierre White, mentor, rival, mirror. Before Gordon Ramsay became a global force in the culinary world, there was Marco Pierre White, the chef who detonated the rigid traditions of haute cuisine in Britain and replaced refinement with raw intensity. White was young, volatile, and fiercely ambitious, and at a time when kitchens were ruled by hierarchy, restraint, and silent obedience, he introduced a new energy that felt closer to rock and roll than classical training. His kitchens were not places of comfort. They were crucibles, demanding absolute commitment and rewarding only those willing to endure relentless pressure. In doing so, White changed not just how food was cooked in Britain, but how chefs understood power, authority, and excellence. It was into this uncompromising world that Ramsay stepped early in his career. Working under White meant far more than learning technique. It meant absorbing a philosophy built on discipline, intensity, and the belief that greatness was forged through confrontation rather than encouragement. Ramsay did not merely survive in that environment, he thrived. He internalized White's standards, his intolerance for mediocrity, and his conviction that fear and pressure could sharpen performance. For a time, the relationship functioned as a classic mentorship, White as the dominant force and established genius, Ramsay as the driven apprentice, hungry to learn and willing to endure the emotional cost of proximity to greatness. But ambition does not remain static, especially in kitchens built on competition. As Ramsay's own reputation began to rise, the dynamic between teacher and student subtly but inevitably shifted. What had once been guidance began to feel like rivalry. Success narrowed the distance between them, and differences over control, recognition, and creative direction surfaced with increasing frequency. The qualities that had initially bonded them, pride, intensity, and an uncompromising sense of self, now pushed them apart. Mentorship, once a source of growth, became a battleground for authority. When the split came, it was neither quiet nor private. It unfolded in full view of the industry, chronicled through interviews, memoirs, and press coverage that framed the fallout as one of the defining culinary schisms of the era. Commentators described it as a clash between two titans whose similarities made coexistence impossible once their paths diverged. Both men were fiercely proud, resistant to compromise, and unwilling to concede control, and those shared traits ultimately proved incompatible within a single orbit. The significance of this rupture extended far beyond personal animosity. White and Ramsay were central figures in a generation that reshaped modern British dining, and their separation came to symbolize the personal cost of success in an industry where creativity, ego, and business are tightly bound together. Their story became a cautionary tale, illustrating how mentorship can fracture once ambition matures into independence, and how inspiration can curdle into opposition when power dynamics shift. In later years, both chefs addressed the feud in their own words, offering accounts that differed in tone and emphasis but aligned on one essential truth. The rift was real, deep, and formative. For Ramsay in particular, the experience is frequently cited as a defining influence, sharpening the combative edge that would later become central to his public persona. What began as reverence ended as rivalry, leaving behind a relationship remembered less for its origins and more for how profoundly it fractured under the weight of greatness. Marcus Waring protégé to public break. For a time, Marcus Waring appeared to be one of the great success stories inside Gordon Ramsay's rapidly expanding culinary empire. Waring was talented, disciplined, and intensely driven, rising through elite kitchens with a reputation for precision and reliability. He was not merely another promising chef passing through Ramsay's orbit. He became someone trusted, relied upon, and publicly associated with the brand itself. To many watching from the outside, Waring represented the ideal protégé, proof that Ramsay's demanding standards could produce not just excellence, but leadership. Their working relationship was close, productive, and strategically aligned. Waring benefited from access to top-tier kitchens, global visibility, and the credibility that came with Ramsay's endorsement. Ramsay, in turn, gained a lieutenant capable of executing his vision with consistency and authority. On the surface, it looked like mentorship functioning exactly as intended, experience guiding potential, opportunity rewarding loyalty, and ambition channeled into shared success. It was a model many young chefs admired and hoped to emulate. But ambition, once nurtured, does not remain contained. As Waring's confidence grew and his own reputation began to solidify, so did a quiet tension beneath the partnership. What had once felt like protection slowly began to feel like constraint. In later interviews, Waring would describe an increasing sense of frustration, a feeling of being kept in a corner, unable to fully express his own creative identity while operating under Ramsay's name and authority. The very structure that had enabled his rise now seemed to limit his future. The ambitions that once aligned began to diverge. Waring wanted autonomy, authorship, and the freedom to define success on his own terms. Ramsay, focused on maintaining control, consistency, and the integrity of his expanding business, viewed the situation through a different lens. What Waring saw as a necessary step toward independence, Ramsay interpreted as a disruption to established agreements and hard-earned structures. The breaking point came when Waring pushed openly for autonomy, seeking to step out from under Ramsay's shadow and build something distinctly his own. By Waring's own admission, that push initiated the unraveling. Ramsay responded by emphasizing contractual obligations, business realities, and professional pride. What followed was not a quiet, dignified separation, but a very public rupture, played out across interviews, press coverage, and legal negotiations that exposed the emotional and financial cost of ambition colliding with authority. The dispute quickly became one of the most closely watched chef fallouts of its era, not because of scandal, but because of its honesty. Both men spoke openly, revealing frustration, disappointment, and a sense of betrayal that resonated far beyond the culinary world. The press chronicled the negotiations, the severed partnerships, and the unmistakable strain of a relationship that had once promised longevity. It was not simply a disagreement over restaurants or branding, but a deeper clash between mentorship and independence, between protection and control. What made the Waring-Ramsay split resonate so widely was its familiarity. It mirrored a pattern seen across high-achievement industries, where rising talent eventually collides with the systems that once enabled its growth. Their fallout became a cautionary tale for chefs entering partnerships with celebrity restaurateurs, illustrating how loyalty can erode when ambition matures faster than freedom. In the years that followed, both men revisited the conflict with greater perspective. Waring acknowledged how the experience shaped his confidence, sharpened his resolve, and ultimately forced him to define himself on his own terms. Ramsay, while rarely sentimental, continued to frame the episode as a hard lesson in trust, control, and the risks inherent in blending mentorship with business. Though the split was painful in public, it marked a turning point for both careers, proving that even the most bitter professional breaks can serve as catalysts for reinvention, and that growth, in elite kitchens as elsewhere, often comes at a personal cost. Eric Ripert, philosophical clash over leadership. Unlike the explosive personal fallouts that defined some of Gordon Ramsay's most famous disputes, The tension with Eric Ripert unfolded on a quieter, more philosophical plane. The two chefs stood at opposite ends of the culinary leadership spectrum. Ripert, the longtime force behind Le Bernardin, was known for a calm, introspective approach to the kitchen, one rooted in mentorship, emotional control, and long-term development. Ramsay, by contrast, had become the public face of intensity, discipline, and confrontation, especially as his television career gained momentum. The clash did not emerge from personal rivalry or business entanglement, but from principle. As Ramsay's on-screen persona grew louder and more theatrical, Ripert began to voice concern about what that style represented. In public interviews, Ripert criticized the culture of shouting and humiliation popularized by televised cooking competitions, describing it as a questionable model for leadership. His remarks were not framed as an attack on Ramsay's talent or success, but as a warning about influence. Ripert questioned what young cooks might internalize when anger and intimidation were presented as pathways to excellence. Media outlets quickly amplified Ripert's comments, not because they were scandalous, but because of who was saying them. This was not an outsider or a critic on the margins of the industry. It was a chef of comparable stature, someone whose authority carried weight. The conversation that followed moved beyond Ramsay himself and into a broader cultural debate about workplace behavior in high-pressure environments. Was fear an effective motivator, or did it simply produce compliance at the cost of creativity and well-being? What made this philosophical divide especially significant was its visibility. By placing two globally recognized chefs on opposite sides of the discussion, the media transformed what had once been an internal industry debate into a mainstream conversation about leadership, power, and responsibility. Kitchens, once romanticized as crucibles of genius, were suddenly being examined through the lens of modern workplace ethics. Ripert's criticism resonated precisely because it offered an alternative vision of authority. He demonstrated that excellence could be achieved without aggression, that discipline did not require humiliation, and that respect could coexist with rigor. In doing so, he challenged the assumption that Ramsay's style was not just effective, but necessary. While the exchange never escalated into a personal feud, its impact lingered. Commentators, chefs, and viewers alike began to reassess the normalization of televised rage and its real-world consequences. In that sense, the Ripert-Ramsay divide marked a turning point, forcing the culinary world to confront a difficult question: not whether intensity creates results, but whether it should define leadership at all. Critics and commentators, Jill and the media sparring. As Gordon Ramsay's profile expanded beyond the closed, hierarchical world of professional kitchens and into the glare of popular culture, his conflicts evolved with it. His battles were no longer confined to chefs, restaurateurs, or business partners. They increasingly unfolded in newspapers, magazines, and public commentary, spaces where reputation could be shaped, sharpened, or dismantled as decisively as any knife in the kitchen. In this new arena, words carried power, and among the most formidable figures Ramsay encountered was Gill, a critic renowned for his incisive prose, cultural authority, and unapologetic judgments. Gill was not a reviewer who softened his conclusions or shielded reputations. His writing blended wit, provocation, and confidence, and when his assessments intersected with Ramsay's work, the result was a series of pointed exchanges that quickly spilled beyond the dining room and into public consciousness. These were not hushed disagreements exchanged behind closed doors. They were visible, deliberate, and often confrontational, drawing attention not only to the restaurants in question, but to the personalities behind them. These confrontations were not feuds in the traditional chef-to-chef sense, yet they carried equal weight in shaping Ramsay's public image. Critics like Jill held enormous influence at the time, capable of elevating a restaurant to cult status or undermining its credibility with a single review. Ramsay, unlike many chefs who chose silence or diplomacy, refused to treat that power passively. Rather than absorbing criticism quietly, he responded sometimes in print, sometimes in interviews, defending his standards, his kitchens, and the expectations he believed diners deserved. In doing so, he openly challenged the authority of critics, positioning himself as a chef unwilling to defer to journalistic judgment simply because it came from the press. This defiance reinforced Ramsay's already combative public persona. To supporters, his responses read as principled and fearless, evidence of a chef who stood behind his work and refused to hide behind publicists or carefully crafted silence. To detractors, the same behavior confirmed a volatile temperament and an inability to accept dissent without escalation. Either interpretation fed the narrative, ensuring that Ramsay remained not just a culinary figure, but a constant media presence, someone whose reactions were scrutinized as closely as his menus. What made these disputes especially significant was their broader cultural impact. When chefs and critics publicly spar, food ceases to be merely about taste or technique and becomes a spectacle of authority, ego, and influence. Reviews transform into ongoing narratives, rebuttals become headlines, and the culinary world begins to resemble a high-stakes arena where credibility is negotiated in real time. Ramsay's willingness to engage openly accelerated this shift, blurring the line between criticism, entertainment, and personal brand at a moment when food media itself was becoming more performative. The episodic nature of these exchanges cemented Ramsay's reputation as someone who confronts opposition directly rather than retreating. He did not always emerge unscathed. Some clashes deepened criticism of his temperament and amplified debates about professionalism. Yet he rarely appeared disengaged, and that consistency mattered. Over time, these moments created a dual legacy: admiration from those who valued his refusal to be passive, and skepticism from those who saw his reactions as unnecessary or excessive. In either case, the media sparring became inseparable from Ramsay's public identity. It reinforced the idea that he was not only a chef of uncompromising standards, but a figure acutely aware of how reputation functions in the modern culinary world. He understood that silence could be interpreted as concession, that narrative vacuum invites control by others, and that in an era where chefs were becoming cultural icons, disengagement carried its own risk. Through these clashes, Ramsay helped redefine what it meant to defend one's work publicly, for better or worse, cementing his place not just in kitchens, but in the broader conversation about authority, criticism, and power in modern food culture. Anthony Bourdain. As the conversation around Gordon Ramsay's leadership style expanded beyond kitchens and into broader cultural discourse, it began to draw in voices who were not directly opposed to him, but deeply conflicted by what his rise represented. These were not rivals fighting for territory or critics seeking provocation, but thoughtful observers wrestling with the consequences of visibility and influence. Among them was Anthony Bourdain, a figure uniquely positioned to interrogate the intersection of food, media, and authenticity. Bourdain understood Ramsay's technical brilliance and respected his command of professional kitchens, yet he was openly uneasy with what television had begun to turn chefs into performers first, craftsmen second. Bourdain did not frame his commentary as a feud, nor did he reduce Ramsay to a caricature. Instead, he aimed his criticism at the system that rewarded spectacle over substance, arguing that the angry chef archetype, magnified by reality television, risked distorting the public's understanding of kitchen culture. In interviews, essays, and conversations, he acknowledged that intensity, discipline, and hierarchy were real components of professional cooking. Kitchens were not gentle places, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But he warned that televised rage, stripped of its context and complexity, could normalize cruelty rather than excellence, transforming pressure into entertainment and leadership into humiliation. Ramsay, whether intentionally or not, had become the most visible symbol of that contradiction. What made Bourdain's perspective especially powerful was not just his eloquence, but his credibility. He had lived the chaos of restaurant life, survived its excesses, and walked away with scars that informed his worldview. He knew the cost of obsession, the toll of ego, and the fragility hidden beneath bravado. When he spoke about Ramsay's television persona, he was not dismissing it outright or questioning Ramsay's legitimacy as a chef. He was interrogating its consequences. The question he posed was no longer whether Ramsay's approach worked, but what it taught millions of viewers about leadership, masculinity, and success when mediated through a screen. This critique landed during a moment when culinary culture itself was shifting. Kitchens were being re-examined through the lenses of workplace ethics, mental health, and sustainability. Younger chefs were questioning traditions they had inherited without consent, and the romanticization of brutality was losing its sheen. What once seemed thrillingly uncompromising now risked appearing outdated or irresponsible. Ramsay's style, which had helped define an era, now existed within a broader debate about power and accountability. Bourdain's voice helped crystallize that shift, giving language to doubts many chefs felt privately but had not yet articulated publicly. Importantly, this tension did not diminish Ramsay's stature. If anything, it underscored his influence. One does not become the subject of serious cultural critique without wielding real power. Ramsay had moved beyond being merely a chef or restaurateur. He had become a symbol. He represented both the heights of culinary excellence and the hazards of turning that excellence into spectacle. His presence forced the industry to confront uncomfortable questions about what it celebrated and why. The debates sparked by figures like Bourdain did not resolve neatly, nor were they meant to. Ramsay continued to evolve, gradually softening his public demeanor while maintaining his insistence on standards and discipline. His later work showed a more measured authority, suggesting adaptation rather than retreat. The industry, meanwhile, continued to wrestle with its contradictions, balancing tradition and reform, pressure and care, authority and empathy. In that sense, Ramsay's clashes, critiques, and controversies were not detours from his legacy. They were integral to it. Each confrontation, whether personal or philosophical, exposed fault lines within a profession undergoing transformation. Through those fault lines, a clearer picture emerged, not of a villain or a hero, but of a figure whose intensity compelled an entire industry to ask a difficult, enduring question. Not whether greatness demands sacrifice, but how much it should cost, and who ultimately pays the price. Jamie Oliver. As Gordon Ramsay's fame expanded beyond the closed world of fine dining and into the reach of mass media, another name began to surface repeatedly in public comparisons, headlines, and cultural commentary: Jamie Oliver. Unlike Ramsay's earlier conflicts, this tension did not emerge from shared kitchens, mentorship, or broken partnerships. It was born instead from something more abstract but equally powerful: competing visions of what modern food culture should look like and who it should serve. Both men rose from the same British culinary renaissance, a period that redefined the nation's relationship with food and chefs alike. Yet, as their careers accelerated, they moved in dramatically different directions. Ramsay became the embodiment of elite professionalism, precision, and uncompromising standards forged in the pressure cooker environments of Michelin-starred kitchens. Oliver, by contrast, positioned himself as the accessible reformer, a chef who spoke directly to households rather than hierarchies, championing home cooking, food education, and public health with an emphasis on inclusion rather than intimidation. The tension between them surfaced gradually, woven through interviews, press remarks, and offhand comments that revealed deeper philosophical differences. Ramsay questioned what he saw as Oliver's oversimplification of cooking, arguing that real mastery required discipline, sacrifice, and an understanding of professional rigor that could not be reduced to slogans or campaigns. He expressed skepticism about the long-term sustainability of Oliver's crusades, suggesting that passion without structure risked diluting standards rather than raising them. Oliver, meanwhile, represented a model that implicitly challenged Ramsay's approach, demonstrating that influence could be built through encouragement rather than fear, and that authority could come from empathy as much as expertise. The rivalry never crystallized into a single explosive confrontation. Instead, it simmered for years, fueled by media comparisons and amplified by tabloids eager to frame the two chefs as cultural opposites locked in an ideological battle. Each public comment, no matter how restrained, fed a larger narrative. Ramsay as the perfectionist gatekeeper defending the sanctity of professional kitchens, Oliver as the populist disruptor breaking down barriers between chefs and the public. The contrast proved irresistible precisely because both men were wildly successful, influential, and operating at the same historical moment, yet speaking to entirely different audiences. What made this rivalry so compelling was not hostility, but symbolism. Ramsay and Oliver came to represent two philosophies competing for the soul of modern food culture. One prioritized mastery, hierarchy, and excellence earned through pressure. The other emphasized accessibility, encouragement, and systemic change. Elite kitchens versus everyday homes. Discipline versus inspiration. Authority earned through intensity versus authority shared through approachability. Their perceived feud mirrored a broader cultural question that extended far beyond cooking. Should leadership demand endurance or invite participation? As food media expanded and chefs became cultural figures rather than anonymous craftsmen, this divide took on greater significance. The Ramsay-Oliver contrast helped shape public expectations of what a chef could be. Not just a technician, but an educator, an entertainer, a reformer, or a disciplinarian. In many ways, the rivalry reflected the growing pains of an industry adjusting to visibility and influence on an unprecedented scale. Over time, the sharpness of the comparison softened. Both men acknowledged, implicitly, and at times explicitly, that their approaches served different purposes and audiences. Oliver's work reshaped conversations around school meals, public health, and food access, while Ramsay's maintained the mystique and rigor of professional excellence. Each left an undeniable mark on global food culture. Yet, the tension remains a defining chapter, illustrating how Ramsay's conflicts were never limited to individuals alone, but often extended to ideas. In that sense, the Ramsay-Oliver divide was never truly about personal dislike. It was a public reckoning over leadership, influence, and responsibility. In an era when chefs stepped out of the kitchen and into the cultural spotlight, no longer hidden behind swinging doors, but shaping how millions thought about food, authority, and success. The many small fallouts. Why Ramsay's career comes with friction. For a time, Marcus Waring appeared to be one of the most compelling success stories inside Gordon Ramsay's rapidly expanding culinary empire. Waring was talented, disciplined, and relentlessly ambitious, rising through elite kitchens with a reputation for precision, calm authority, and consistency under pressure. He was not simply another gifted chef benefiting from Ramsay's spotlight. He became an extension of the brand itself, entrusted with responsibility that signaled confidence and long-term intent. To many observers within the industry, it looked like the proof that Ramsay's famously demanding standards could produce not just excellent cooks, but future leaders. Their professional relationship was built on performance and trust. Waring delivered results, and Ramsay rewarded that reliability with opportunity. The partnership appeared productive, strategic, and mutually beneficial. Waring gained access to world-class kitchens, international recognition, and the credibility that came with Ramsay's endorsement. Ramsay, in turn, gained a lieutenant capable of executing his vision with discipline and authority, someone who could be trusted to uphold standards even in Ramsay's absence. From the outside, it looked like mentorship functioning exactly as it was meant to, with experience guiding potential and opportunity reinforcing loyalty. But ambition rarely remains static. As Waring's confidence grew and his own reputation began to solidify, a quiet tension developed beneath the surface of the partnership. What once felt like protection gradually began to feel like confinement. The structure that had enabled Waring's rise also limited his ability to define success on his own terms. In later interviews, Waring would describe an increasing sense of frustration, a feeling of being kept in a corner, operating under another man's authority, long after he felt ready to stand independently. The kitchens were elite, the standards uncompromising, but the creative ceiling felt increasingly low. The ambitions that once aligned began to pull in opposite directions. Waring wanted authorship, autonomy, and the freedom to take risks without seeking permission. Ramsay focused on preserving control, consistency, and the integrity of a fast-growing business empire, viewed the situation through a different lens. What Waring perceived as a necessary step toward independence, Ramsay saw as a destabilizing force, one that threatened established agreements, brand coherence, and the hierarchy that kept the operation functioning. The breaking point came when Waring pushed openly for autonomy, seeking to step out from Ramsay's shadow and build something distinctly his own. By Waring's own admission, that push initiated the unraveling. It was a moment of assertion that carried professional and personal consequences. Ramsay responded by emphasizing contractual obligations, business realities, and professional pride, framing the dispute not as emotional betrayal, but as a matter of responsibility and control. The gap between their perspectives widened rapidly. What followed was not a quiet or graceful separation, but a very public rupture. Interviews, press coverage, and legal negotiations exposed the emotional and financial toll of the split, revealing how deeply intertwined mentorship and business had become. The culinary press documented every development, from severed partnerships to competing narratives of loyalty and independence. It was no longer just a disagreement between two chefs. It became a public case study in what happens when ambition outgrows the structures designed to contain it. The Waring-Ramsay dispute quickly became one of the most talked-about chef fallouts of its era precisely because of its transparency. Both men spoke openly, acknowledging frustration, disappointment, and a sense of betrayal that resonated beyond the restaurant world. It was not simply a conflict over restaurants or branding, but a deeper clash between mentorship and self-determination, between protection and control, between gratitude and ambition. What made the split resonate so widely was its familiarity. The story mirrored a pattern seen across high-achievement industries, where rising talent eventually collides with the systems that once enabled its success. For young chefs watching closely, it served as a cautionary tale about partnerships with powerful mentors and celebrity restaurateurs, highlighting how loyalty can erode when ambition matures faster than freedom. It exposed the emotional complexity of growth in environments where hierarchy and excellence are inseparable. In the years that followed, both men revisited the conflict with greater perspective. Waring acknowledged that the experience, though painful, sharpened his resolve and forced him to define himself without the safety net of a powerful patron. It accelerated his evolution from protégé to independent leader. Ramsay, while rarely sentimental in public, continued to frame the episode as a hard lesson in trust, control, and the risks inherent in blending mentorship with business. Though the split was bitter and highly visible, it ultimately marked a turning point for both careers. It proved that even the most painful professional breaks can act as catalysts for reinvention, and that in elite kitchens, as in any environment driven by ambition, growth often demands separation. The Waring-Ramsay fallout remains a defining chapter not because of who was right or wrong, but because it captures the cost of ambition when mentorship becomes a ceiling rather than a foundation. If this story changed the way you see Gordon Ramsay and the world behind elite kitchens, don't let it end here. Like the video, subscribe for more deep dive stories where talent, ambition, and conflict collide, and share this with someone who loves food culture beyond the surface.